Major funding for this production is provided by American Bank of Lafayette, the financial choice of the 80s. Additional funding provided by the Friends of LPB.
Journalists agree on very little. It's a profession, a trade, an art of people with varying opinions. But one thing they pretty much agree on, that a man named Edward R. Murrow was a preeminent journalist of our times. When Edward R. Murrow came home from Europe, it was time for him to pick a successor, someone who he felt could continue in what he did best, to present the whole world to the world. And he chose someone, guess where from, folks? Ferriday, Louisiana. And we're in that gentleman's home outside of Washington. And Howard K. Smith, thank you for letting us in your beautiful home.
It's a pleasure.
Howard, how about those early days in Ferriday? What was that like growing up there?
I didn't do much growing there. I was born in a flood, a Mississippi River flood, and we left by the time I was 3, so I don't remember much about it. We moved to Murrow, Louisiana, and that's where I was brought up until I was 12.
Yes, sir.
And I rather liked Murrow. I liked it better than I think any place I had lived in my young life. I hated to move to New Orleans. Till later I learned to like New Orleans too, but I moved there in the Depression because my father couldn't get a job. And Murrow I enjoyed very much.
You still have family in Louisiana, is it
Lots
correct?
of it, yes. I'm part Cajun, you know. My mother was came from a family named Annette, and I have quite a few Cajun relatives in Baton Rouge and down around Lafayette in that part of the world. And my father lived in an ancestral plantation along the Mississippi, and he has relatives there too. And my brother is in New Orleans. He's a dentist there.
When did this, I know that you were editor of your school newspaper in New Orleans. Where was it? Fort J. High School?
Fort J. High School.
Editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. Is that where the beginnings of journalism?
No, I don't know how the beginnings of journalism came about. They kind of came about like spontaneous combustion, and the decision was never made. Just since the age of 8, when I was discontent with the way the story of Peter Rabbit turned out, so I rewrote it. Ever since then, I just was inevitable I was going to be a journalist, and I never decided it. It just happened.
You know, I don't know why, but I would have thought that a man like you with this mentality and aptitude, you'd have been a natural for the law or government or political science. I'm pleased as I can be as a fellow journalist with a degree in journalism that you chose that field.
Well, it takes two different minds, I think. A lawyer has to love detail. And well, what they said of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan said of Jimmy Carter, he can identify 250 parts of an automobile, but he can't put them together and make them work like an automobile. I think a lawyer is pretty much that way. His mind must love detail. A generalist, I think generalists make good presidents, but they also make good journalists. And I think I can cover anything, any story you can think of. I can do the research and cover the story. And that's the kind of mind that I have, and I prefer to have that rather than a lawyer's mind.
How would you define a good journalist?
Someone who's curious, intellectually curious, and just curious about humans and how they behave. In my case here in Washington, curiosity about power, how people use it and how they misuse it, and why they misuse it. And I think curiosity is the main feature. Then an ability to express oneself, which I think you learn from saturating yourself in the best things that have been written in the English language, and expressing it.
Is the craft, the trade of journalism hurt by such things as the Hitler diaries, which have now been proven to be false?
Yeah.
That hurts us, doesn't it?
Well, I think we make a lot of mistakes, so I don't think anyone ever assumes we're perfect. I don't think it hurts very much. Now, I knew those things were a fake from the first moment I heard about them. 1 second after I heard Hitler's diaries, I knew they were a fake, because I know Hitler's personality, and Hitler's personality is not a contemplative personality. He's not the kind of man who likes to write things down and think about things. He devoted his life to the spoken word. He liked to dominate small groups with the spoken word and mass audiences with the spoken word. He's not the man who would write anything down. He never wrote a word of Mein Kampf down. He dictated the whole thing to Rudolf Hess. His communiques were all dictated, so I knew that a man with that personality would never write 60 volumes of memoirs. It does hurt the journalistic profession a little, but then we have a lot of virtues, too.
We have some virtues. How about Tulane? How was that?
Well, in a way, it saved my life. I wouldn't have gotten an education otherwise. It was in the Depression. We had no money, and the mayor gave 2 scholarships to the 2 best students in high school, and I got one of those. Otherwise, I couldn't have gone. Of course, I could have gone to LSU, but I would have had to have money to pay for the board and room. I didn't have any money.
I know over the years it must have caused you great regret not to have gone to LSU.
Well,
Spoken like a real tiger.
It became a real good university after a while.
And Howard, you were also an athlete, which I bet most folks don't know. You were a star athlete at Tulane.
Yes, I did rather well.
You were a track man, wasn't that?
I held the high hurdles record at the Southwestern Relays, as they were called. I think they were called the John Morris.
Yes, Johnny Morris, yes.
I broke Johnny Morris's record in the high hurdles, and then his son came along and broke my record.
Now, there's something not known about you generally at all. You went to work on the old States item in New Orleans.
That's right. Oh, it was the item.
Item,
And the
yes.
States later bought it.
And that was very competitive to the morning paper, to the Picayune, was it not?
I think it was far better than the Picayune, better written, and a better newspaper. It just didn't have the circulation. I don't know what you do to get circulation. It didn't have the advertising, so it eventually died or was bought. But it was a very good newspaper.
What kind of stuff did you cover? Were you a general?
I was a
assignment?
police beat reporter, and then a job opened up writing stories about foreign affairs, and since I was fascinated by foreign affairs, I applied for the job, and they gave it to me. And I rewrote things from abroad, and took little stories from abroad, researched them, and made them big stories with all the background. And I was only on the item for about a year, and then I got the Rhodes Scholarship and left.
That must have been a marvelous feeling out of Ferriday, Louisiana, to win that Rhodes Scholarship.
Well, money was my big problem, and that provided me with money. That's the first independent income I'd ever had, so I could travel all over Europe. You know, at Oxford, you go to school 6 months, and you travel 6 months. So I was delighted. I must say it was a huge step in my life.
Let me give you a mysterious quote. You said, Oxford was almost wasted on me.
Well, scholastically, I became so concerned about Adolf Hitler and found too few people concerned about it that I became an agitator at Oxford. And I was more a politician than a student. I stopped studying and organized demonstrations and took petitions to number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence, and made speeches and all sorts of things.
Were your folks aware of all of this going on?
And I don't think my folks were ever very much aware of me in that respect. My brother was somewhat aware of me, but I don't think my father paid much attention. No one cared about that.
At Oxford,
I did what I wanted to anyhow. The family knew that.
At Oxford, you were the first American president of the Labor Club.
That's right.
What kind of experience? How did they let a Yank run the thing?
Well, I went out and made speeches, and I think the ardor and zeal of my campaign to stop Hitler was convinced all the people to vote for me, and they voted for me, and I was elected.
I went back and read your classic, Last Train from Berlin, and one of the early passages in it that positively fascinated me. You were at the Munich Opera, and all of a sudden there was an opportunity to see one Adolf Hitler close up. And you were shocked. He didn't turn out to be a Teutonic god or a Kaiser Wilhelm standing 6 feet tall with a white mustache. Give us your first impression of this man close up.
He looked very inferior to me, and looked very uninteresting. And it was amazing to me how he could turn into a fire-eating dragon on the podium talking to a mass audience. In private, close up, he had nothing really to say. His mind was empty. I don't think he'd ever read anything in his life. He had a few slogans, and that's all. He had this capacity for roaring oratory, which compelled people. In fact, it frightened me when I listened to him talking. Such a power in such an inferior man. Dr. Speer, his architect, has written about his lunches with Hitler and said what dreadful bores they were because Hitler had nothing to say. And I think he capsulized my impression of Hitler very much.
At what point did young Howard K. Smith, observing these going-ons, at what point did you say, we have in our midst a monster, and this monster may well consume us all?
About 1936, I went to Germany. I had a scholarship to Heidelberg. I wanted to learn German. And I didn't know what I was getting into. It was a propaganda course. And when I began to understand German, I could hear these professors who were required to make lectures to us making propaganda lectures about how the Germans had been oppressed by the whole world, by all lesser races, mainly the Jewish race, but also the black race. And I knew of no case of them being oppressed by blacks. I don't think they ever saw a black. Then I went through the country traveling, and everywhere I went, there were these train loads of tanks and guns. And I remembered my own country, where I don't think I'd seen a soldier in 10 years. There were about 100,000 of them. How ill-prepared we were for these people who obviously, from these propaganda lectures, were out to conquer. I would stand on the street corners and see the Hitler Youth marching by and hear them singing, Heute gehört uns Deutschland, morgen die ganze Welt. Today Germany is ours, tomorrow the whole world. Well, that scared me to death. So it was then, in 1936, in the summer.
Well, when you and the handful of people who felt the way that you did, who cried havoc, when you sent back these suspicions, these reports, these emanations, how were they treated? How were you all treated?
America was an isolationist country, and we just did not believe we had to, and we didn't want to go back into the world anymore. We thought we'd been tricked in World War I. They thought that. And it was none of our business. Let Europe, no more Uncle Sam. And I think that was the mood, and you just couldn't break it. You read about Roosevelt being almost heartbroken talking to students at that time. And they would tell him, you should do more about poverty and less about arms and weapons, at a time when our life was going to depend on arms and weapons. I think America was just in a bad, wrong state of mind.
When did the reality of the concentration camps occur to you?
Oh, rather late. I knew about concentration camps, but I didn't know they were the places of horror they were. We liberated one. I was with the United States Ninth Army at that time, and we opened one up. And I'll tell you, it was hell. It was Dante's hell, but magnified 10 times, much worse. But I did not know they were that bad until that moment. In Berlin in 40 and 41, I lived in an apartment house, and just above me on the next landing were 2 Jewish ladies. And we exchanged things, food. They cooked things and gave them to me. And then one night they disappeared. And I went up there, and the Gestapo had its seal on them, closed by order of the Geheimstaatspolizei. And I knew they'd gone to the concentration camp. I thought that was bad, but I didn't know how bad until the end of the war when we opened these camps up.
Sir, you were the last American correspondent out of Berlin, out of Hitler's Germany, were you not?
Yes.
Was that a frightening experience leaving? Was it
No,
tense?
it was a delightful experience leaving. I was afraid they were going to keep me.
Yes.
That was my worry.
Yes.
Instead, they finally gave me a permit to leave the country. They'd forbade me to broadcast, forbidden me to broadcast. And then I applied for a visa, and they wouldn't give me one. So when they finally gave me one, I was delighted to leave the country. No, I was very happy. And as I crossed the border, the Swiss guard said, "Do you know, sir, that Pearl Harbor has just been bombed?" And my answer was, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" I've never asked a second time.
You went to Fleet Street in London, and I think got on with UPI, did you not, as a correspondent?
At the beginning of the war.
Yes.
And they sent me to Germany because I spoke German.
Sent you back to Germany. And you're one of the few men of our times who's followed not one, not two, not three, but 4 of the major armies. For example, you covered the Wehrmacht as it conquered France.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That must have been a monstrous experience to see that lovely country fall. And
Well, not much damage was done. It was a quick, incisive surgical job, so there was very little damage, just a broken people, broken in spirit. But not many lives were lost, so it wasn't like World War I. And they had simply made so many foolish mistakes in having a Maginot type, a lion type of mind. You don't fight wars with that. You fight them with things that move. It was fascinating, but not too worrisome.
then you covered the French underground.
Then I joined them. After the French woke up from this shock, they began to rebel. And not waiting for us to come, they liberated the areas next to Switzerland, where I was then. And so I joined them. And we went all through the mountains, and I was required to carry a machine gun. No cars had windshields in them. They were all broken out. And I sat there with a machine gun. I did not know how to shoot and didn't know what I would do with it if some Germans appeared. They made me do it. Anyhow, I enjoyed that. That was lots of fun. I was covering underground movements then.
Yes.
When I left Germany, CBS told me to cover all the underground movements in Europe. And so I discovered Tito. I was the first reporter to find out who Tito was. And that was my function until I got out and joined the United States Ninth Army.
What was the French underground comprised of? Great patriots, great
Yeah,
brave men?
all young men, of course. And
Were many killed, the underground?
not many, but those who were killed were tortured to death, so it was horrible. But when they came out from the underground, they were on top. They were winning. We had landed on the other side of France, and they knew they were going to win. And the Germans in the town I was in knew they were going to win. So the Germans who had the underground people in prison simply opened up the doors, gave the underground men their keys, and they got in the prison cells. So it was, by that time, it was pretty inevitable that we were going to win.
I want to ask you about the subject of evil. And I'm talking about the Nuremberg War Crimes Trial, which you covered. When you finally confront those men who murdered whole generations, the Goerings and the Himmlers and these other people, and there they sat, what kind of people were they?
Well, Hess was demented, and still is. I think he was always weak of mind. And to become a Nazi back in the days when nobody was joining the Nazi Party, you had to pretty well have something wrong with you, because there was no good reason to do it, and it didn't make any sense. And he was demented. There's no doubt about it, unbalanced. Goering was not, but he was a brute. He's the kind of man who would make a good sheriff in the time of the Klan, who would go out and shoot people up, beat people up for the Klan. He's a big, heavy brute. Each one was different. The SS men were just young men who had been trained to be brutal and cruel. And they cracked under the strain of the Nuremberg trials. The
tough guys.
Yeah, they cracked very badly and became extremely weak, willing to confess to anything, to things they hadn't done even. But they were a sorted bunch. Some of them were adjudged innocent. Schacht, I think, was declared innocent. When they displayed on the screen the horrors of the concentration camp, which some of these people had never seen, Schacht had never seen it, he refused to look at it. He didn't know it was that bad himself. He had helped Hitler stabilize the German economy before the war, and he was tried for that, but I think they found he had done nothing seriously wrong.
Did you know Albert Speer?
No.
You never met him? No. He seemed to be a different man, at least in his writings, when we only have that version of him.
Right. He's a more intelligent man, I'll say that.
Yes.
Different? I don't know. He was an ambitious young man who got in on the winning side, he thought. I don't have a great deal of pity for him, but he was more intelligent than the others, therefore more useful in finding out what that period was like. We haven't got many intelligent people who were in that inner circle who can tell us.
Speer reminds me of the current German movie Mephisto. He sold his soul in order to be the architect of his times.
Mm-hmm. He drew up these grandiose plans for Berlin,
yes.
A city no one on earth would want to live in. And no shops in it, just grand monuments, the biggest in the world. I think they were horrible plans.
Some other great people whom you have known and covered. What little bit about Edward R. Murrow, the man?
Well, he was a very impressive man. He had a deep and impressive voice, but his personality was very commanding. When he walked into a room, whether you saw him or not, you knew something had changed in the room. His voice was such that if he just said 26, it would sound like the most important utterance ever made by man. And he was very, very kind and to the people he had hired. He hired the first news staff on radio, and he would have done anything for us, and in fact did. He was my protector at CBS for a long time when the executives were trying to get at me.
CBS fired you one time, as a matter of fact.
After 20 years, yes, they fired me. They were supposed to give me a gold watch, and they didn't do it. But recently, when I left ABC, CBS sent me the gold watch.
Finally. Darn lucky you didn't get a calendar, huh? That's usually the emolument. How did you, in '61, I think it was, you did the first one-on-one interview with one Richard Nixon.
That was much later. That was when Nixon was president.
President?
Yes.
Yes.
That would have been 69 or 70. Yes, I did. It wasn't that I was favored in any way. It was he said to the three networks, I'm going to give each of you a one-on-one interview. And ABC, having the first letter of the alphabet, we went first. So I had the first one, all by myself with him.
When the cameras were off and the lights were out, that terrible red light, what did you think about him?
Well, I thought he had a real talent for foreign affairs. You know, you have to have a bit of meanness in you to do the right thing in foreign affairs, and he had it. And he had a good brain for it, too. He hired Henry Kissinger, who I think is the greatest diplomat this country has produced. And Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. He settled the Vietnam War, not satisfactorily, but there's some things that can't be settled satisfactorily. Like the saying that when you've got a mouthful of hot soup, the next thing you do is going to be wrong, no matter what it is. Well, that's the way it was with Vietnam. He got us out. He made the opening to China, which really helped us a great deal in our relations with Russia. Yet he started the détente with Russia, and I think could have kept Russia disciplined and not friendly, but not explosively hostile if he was still there. So I give Nixon a great deal of credit for that. But as a person, he was very insecure, and he didn't know quite what to say. He was not very good at small talk, and he had no feel for domestic American affairs at all. He let the economy go to hell. That's where our troubles of today began, actually. You know, Johnson didn't spend much money on the Great Society, $4 billion a year at the peak, but the plans were open-ended, and in the Nixon period, they kept adding to them until the things were explosively expensive, and we have these high deficits today. But that was Nixon's feeling, as he told Teddy White, that you don't need a president for home affairs, they take care of themselves. Well, they don't.
They really don't.
Yeah.
You've had a unique honor and experience of being the newsman chosen to moderate first the Nixon-Kennedy debates and then the Carter-Reagan debates. How did you feel about those Nixon-Kennedy debates?
Well, I enjoyed doing them. I think it's a great pleasure to be able to tell the president to shut up. And very few people get that chance, and they have to do it. So I enjoyed them both. The first one, I felt Nixon had lost it before he came in because he was famous. He was the world-famous vice president. Kennedy was a rather unknown senator. But in one night, he had let Kennedy raise himself to Nixon's level, and that's why the election ended, with Kennedy winning by that much, just barely winning. And it happened that night. Kennedy told me he thought he won that night. And Nixon looked defeated when he came in. He said, I should never have agreed to this. What a foolish thing it was. And I think that's what beat him, that psychological...
What was those two men's demeanor before the cameras came on? Did they look uptight to you?
Not Kennedy. Kennedy looked as though this is a gift from heaven. He felt like, he looked like a young athlete who couldn't be beaten. Even if he made mistakes, he would win. He would be brought up to the level of the famous man immediately. Nixon looked whipped before he came in. I made a mistake. How could I have done this?
How will history look upon Kennedy's very brief presidency?
If they examine his record closely, I don't think they'll give it very high marks because he wasn't a very good president. He couldn't get things through Congress. He was rather timid about approaching Congress. Previous to that, he had been a very poor senator and a worse congressman. So actually, you know, in his third year, people were wearing lapel buttons that said, I sure miss Ike, and down below in small letters, hell, I miss Harry Truman too. I don't think he'll be looked upon with the high regard we now have of him because of that tragic way in which he died. We think very highly of him because of that, but as a president, he didn't make much, he didn't do very well.
On the other hand, history seems to constantly be elevating Harry S. Truman, does it not?
I think justly.
You do agree with that?
Yes, the only one who never went to college, and yet knew more about history than any of them. I thought he made a lot of decisions, a lot of them awfully good, and some of them terrible, but most of them were good. He tried hard, and he entered politics a poor man, and he left politics a poor man. Someone who does that can't be all bad.
That could not have been said of President Johnson, could
No,
it?
it couldn't.
Then how about the Carter-Reagan debates? How about those two men first?
They were rather similar, in fact. You know, Carter came in really uptight. For the first time, the candidates refused to see one another beforehand at Carter's insistence. They were put in separate rooms at Carter's insistence. When time for the debate to begin came, they came out, and Carter stood motionless at his podium and didn't look at Reagan. Reagan finally got tired of that and walked over and shook hands with him. Then after the debate, Carter and his wife walked out without speaking to anybody. Reagan came over and sat down and talked to us for a while. So it was quite clear that Carter felt he was in a losing position, and Reagan was very happy. He felt he was in a winning position.
I think you told me before we went on the air that Reagan showed up early as the consummate showman to check the lights and to make sure that the lighting, is that correct?
Yes, he always was the first one to come so his men could look over the lights. He didn't himself. But when everything was settled, we would sit down and chat. And I was amazed at his charm. I thought he was going to be rather bellicose because I'd had an argument with him by mail some years before when he was a Hollywood actor. And he made some statements about me that I didn't think were right. So I thought he would be difficult, but he wasn't. He was really charming, really terribly likable. That was one thing that surprised me. Second, how little he knew surprised me. When we talked about politics and government, he didn't know very much. I think he has a mind full of clippings from the National Review, the conservative periodical, for the past 20 years. I think he's made up his mind and he's not taking advice on anything new, and that worries me.
Well, you know, you weren't too impressed with Carter.
Not at all.
And obviously you're not really impressed as a president with Reagan. What does that say about a system then? And you're a dispassionate, a trained observer, so you have no axes to grind. What does that say about a system that we had those two men to choose from?
No,
assuming that you're right in assessments of both of them.
Yeah, I think it's a bad system. I think the basic trouble with it is there's too much money in it. There's more special interest money poured into American politics than into the politics of any government on earth. It costs about half a million times more to elect American to Congress than it does to take to elect an Englishman to the House of Commons. There's just far too much money. Men paying $10 million to get a $60,000 job. And I think it means you have to beg for money. Once you beg, you're beholden to the people who give it to you. And it comes close to bribery. We almost have a bribery political system, and it's very, very bad. And the best people, Americans, don't want to get involved in it. Even if they go into politics and say, I'm going to work for the people, they find their opponent is getting money from the special interest, so they've got to compete by getting money from the special interest, and soon they're bound hand and foot, too. I think it's a very bad system. I'd like to see it outlawed.
Can a Hitler, a totalitarian movement, happen in our times? Can that ever happen again?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think it can. It's happened in Vietnam, for example, in our time. A totally totalitarian country has come into existence. In this country, I suppose if we were hard-pressed enough, we could. If the disorder was so great that people wanted order more than anything, they would sacrifice their freedom to take order. I think in this country it would very likely be a military type of dictatorship if it happened. Because we have had so many generals who become presidents. They've all been very good and democratic-minded men, thank heavens. Eisenhower topmost, or Washington topmost. But that's the kind I would expect if we came under dire stress. If we lost a confrontation with Russia and Russia became dominant in Central America, South America, Europe, and Asia, I think we'd turn into a garrison state quickly, a totalitarian one, run by officers, because we would be scared, and all Americans would be for it.
Would Howard K. Smith like to have been president?
No, I don't think. I have an appetite, a scholar's appetite for studying power. I like to know presidents and ask them questions and find out what they're doing. But I don't have the politician's appetite to have power. Too many things I'd have to do I don't want to do. Begging for money is one. And then being kind to people with whom you disagree. They have to do that. It takes a special appetite to be a politician. I don't have that appetite.
Sir, you've been a delightful guest. I was totally intimidated interviewing Howard K. Smith, who's interviewed all of the great men on earth, but you've made it simple and a delight, and you're a hell of a man, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Major funding for this production is provided by American Bank of Lafayette, the financial choice of the 80s. Additional funding provided by the Friends of LPB and Union National Life Insurance, a Louisiana company serving Louisiana and the South since 1926.